Welcome. This is our early literacy assessment in the seminar room today. My name is Kelly True. I work for Novak Educational Consulting as a consultant, but I also work for Groton-Dunstable Public Schools. I'm the K-8 ELA supervisor there, and I've been doing some work around early literacy assessment and screenings, and I'm happy to be here to talk to you a little bit today about what some of those screenings might look like and some of the decisions that are being made at the state level around all of this new legislation that's happening and all these new things that are coming out around it, which I think is probably one of the burning topics on everyone's mind is what exactly does the dyslexia screening mean for us? What are we going to have to do with it? And what kind of regulations are going to come down from the state for that? I'm here today with Craig Waterman. Would you like to introduce yourself?
I'm Craig Waterman. I work for the Department of Education in the Center for Instructional Support. So we do everything sort of involving curriculum, educational evaluation, prep, English language learners. And I'll share with you a tool that we're promoting around how you type on assessment literacy, particularly with teachers, but could be generalized.
We were just having an interesting conversation around what some of those struggles are when you're talking to staff about new assessments and just kind of getting where everybody is at their entry point into assessment and data literacy. It's not always easy. So we're going to start right out with the burning question about dyslexia, because I'm sure that's on your mind. So this is the acceptable definition, I guess, for dyslexia. It's a specific learning disability. That's neurological in origins. It has difficulty with accurate and/or fluid word recognition. It also can be characterized by poor spelling and decoding abilities. The one thing that this does point out is that the challenges that kids with dyslexia have are often unexpected in relation to their other cognitive abilities. So usually you're not looking at somebody who has a significant weakness in reading across the board. Some of these things are disparate from other strengths and weaknesses that they have. So that's one of the things that's about there. It also can include problems in reading comprehension and a reduced reading experience that impedes growth in vocabulary background knowledge. So this is kind of the acceptable definition, I guess, of what dyslexia is, and that's what we're looking at. And this, I think, is one that the state is probably going to be putting out. So with the new legislation for dyslexia, they are going to be requiring that students be screened in kindergarten for dyslexia. And there's a lot of information that has been coming out about dyslexia and different kinds of screeners and assessments that help to work with that. So what we're going to talk about today is a pilot program that the state has for screening in dyslexia. And also, once you've screened students, then kind of what do you do with them? Because there are other assessments and other ways to gain information about what the needs are of the students. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll look at some of those assessments, and then Craig is going to take over and use some tools for you to start thinking about the assessments that you use in your own district and where you might need to either put some more resources or investigate more as you move through the process as well. So I think the most important thing is that we're all in the same place, mostly unless you're ahead of the game starting out with this. So I started looking at this year in my district because I will be in charge of having to implement that and to bring in some systems and supports that will help us to kind of go through the process too. So we're all learning and in this together, and hopefully we can all help each other through it. So the considerations for early screening and literacy. The DESE is currently conducting a pilot. Is anybody part of the DESE pilot in here? No?
Word to school.
Oh, that is using? Which one of these are they using?
Start.
Okay, so they are currently piloting 4 different screening tools for dyslexia. They are the ISIP, Early Reading Assessment, which is iStation. Does anyone use iStation in their district? That's becoming more and more popular, I think. I hadn't heard a lot about it, but now I'm hearing a lot about it, so you use it, okay. STAR has been around forever. That's Renaissance Learning. A lot of districts use STAR. Does anyone here use STAR? Do you use the early literacy and, or just the STAR reading? The STAR reading. So they do have the early literacy one that goes K1, but we'll see how that goes. And then the Lexia Rapid Assessment, that was that came out with the Early Literacies Grant Either last year or the year before, they had offered that as part of the grant if you had applied and were able to do that. Has anyone used the Lexia Rapid assessment? Are you currently using it now?
We're using Lexia, but not the Rapid.
Not the Rapid. How did you, what do you think?
I mean, I love Lexia.
Do you? So you're biased, is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay. And then the last one is math growth reading. Do we have anyone using math in here? Okay, yeah. So a lot of districts use math, or a lot of districts also use STAR. iStation is one of the newer ones I think that has come out. But these are the 4 that are in the DESE pilot program. So right now they're collecting data on, they already kind of vetted the success in the research with the 4 different programs. But right now they're collecting data, more qualitative data, kind of the ease of use, what teachers think of it, what they think of the information about it, the quality of what's coming out of it. So those are all contributing factors to how they're going to make their decision. So by the end of this school year, in June, there should be recommendations coming out of DESE for one of these screeners. It doesn't mean you have to use one of those screeners, but those are the ones that will be recommended by the state as being high quality screeners for dyslexia. Okay. Any question about any of these?
Just one?
Yes.
Just one will be?
Oh, sorry. I do think that they are going to, I'm not sure if they're only going to choose one. They might put 2 forward, or if they collect data and they're all really successful and they all meet the criteria of use and all of those things, maybe they'll put forward more than one.
And the ones that were not included in this pilot, is there a reason they were not included, or is it just a, these are the only ones? I mean, so I'm thinking like we were doing the Dibbles, the early screener, like did they not pick that for a reason as it to be a pilot?
That's a very good question. I think that they have a panel of experts that are looking into specifically for the dyslexia screen, different aspects that had to meet certain criteria for the quality of the information you were getting, the type of sub-assessments that it has, and the information that it gives specific to dyslexia. So I'm not sure if maybe that had to do with the decision of why they specifically chose those 4. But I did say I would at least give people the information that these are the 4 that they're looking at, and they'll put forth their recommendations by the end of the year. So if you want to look more into any of them, you can kind of see what they're about. Yes?
Do you know if anyone in the pilot, any of these screenings are being done in a language other than English? So for dual language learners at the
That's a
early
good
literacy
question.
level and Spanish, for example?
I don't know that, but I do know that the Lexia Rapid does have that functionality. So I would think that they might use that, but I don't know the answer to that question. I'm sorry, if they're actually doing that in the pilot, or will have, because I'm sure you're looking for the data, right, of what comes out of that, if it's as effective for both populations.
I have a question to follow up. I'm the EL director, as I
Yeah.
mentioned. So students, from what I understand, was collaborating with our special education department, students who are EL currently getting ESL services cannot be qualified on an IEP for specific learning disability. So how does that, I mean, then the test is really irrelevant, right?
Can you say that one more time?
So
Do you say that L students can't be?
students cannot be identified with specific learning disability on their IEP.
I've never heard that before in my life.
I've never heard that before. It's DESE regulation.
So
Is that, have you ever heard it?
I had not heard that,
And I know a lot of Ls that are on IEPs, of course, because they're learning.
Well, so once they've exited services, yes, but. if
But
they're
not-
currently
they can't be-
receiving ESL services, they can be put on for developmental delay.
No,
However, they cannot be identified for specific learning.
Really?
afterwards.
That was the district policy.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
not, it's because of the exclusionary process.
Yes.
So you have to be able to exclude.
That is not language, it's not, right,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay.
So, yeah.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
You just can't jump to it.
Right.
Our old SPED director is actually working at this conference, so
Ah,
I'm sure she would be happy. We've had multiple conversations
about it, yeah. And it is, I mean, that's like kind of an age-old problem of figuring out when teachers come to you and say, you know, I have this student, I know that they're L, but I think it's more than that. right? That's what they always come and say. I really think it's more than that. You know, I think they need help, and so how do you tease out
Well,
whether,
just because they're speaking Chinese to me, they're just gonna be dyslexic, so it makes sense.
Right.
Oh my God.
right, it's very, very hard to pinpoint
Yeah.
what is the direct cause because they're also interrelated. Yes?
And I believe the language is due primarily to, you know, emotional disturbance or, you know, the language piece. So it's not that they can't, but it just can't be primary.
But you have
Oh.
to list, so
Okay.
you do have to put, like, first, and then, yeah.
I see.
So that's why I'm like, well,
Yeah, so
why
that would
even
be,
give it to them if they can't qualify for anything?
right, that would be very, very
This is-
interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, the other thing about the pilot is that all of these choices, like you were saying, the person that was saying they use the DIPLs, like all of these choices are online assessments. The iStation, STAR, Lexia, and MAP, they're all online assessments for kids. And so, you know, one of the other things that you think about is when you have kindergartners that are taking an online assessment, you know, is that easy for them? Or how fluid are they with it? When are we giving that assessment? So that we can make sure that it's not, you know, a technology type thing that's a barrier to that. So there's a lot of considerations that I think districts really have to kind of dig in and think about what's right for them as they're doing it. But these are definitely being experimented with. The research is certainly there that supports all four of these choices. You know, the ease of use stuff will be coming out in terms of how teachers feel like they're able to use it and the information that they get with that. And it will give you at least a screen on what your kids are doing in your district. So, and in talking about a screener, the functionality of a screener is really just to pop kids up. So when you have a universal screener, it means you're universally screening everybody. So everybody is taking this test and they're looking at, okay, you seem to be okay on this, you did fairly well on this, you did okay on this, you might want to be looked at. We might need to look at you because of how you scored on this. So really, a screener is meant to kind of flag kids that you want to look more closely at because something went wrong there. Could it be a technology thing? Yeah. Could it be they had a bad day? Yes, of course. Could it be test anxiety? Yes. There's a lot of different things that happen with that. So we really have to look at kids because if you take your screener and you say, okay, all these kids that were flagged as not doing well are dyslexic, then you're gonna have a big problem on your hands. So you really, really have to be careful about some of the practices that you put in place around a screener. So that's really the function of the screener is to say, these are the kids we want to look more closely at. And so what does that look like when you're looking more closely at somebody? So normally when you use a screener, it will tell you that there's a deficit somewhere in a child's learning. And those deficits usually fall into a few different categories, especially when you're dealing with dyslexia. So one of those categories is phonological deficit. And so you might want to give a student, if they are popping up as having trouble in the phonemic awareness, phonics category, you might want to give them a deeper look with something like the DIPLs, or a CTOP, which is the Comprehensive Test of Phonological Processing, or this is the Advanced and Beginning to Coding Survey. So there are some other options for you if you want to dig deeper into phonics and phonemic awareness, that kind of area. So usually this deficit is characterized by a weakness in phonemic awareness and phonics, and it presents as poor reading accuracy and poor spelling. So these are just some choices of how you can dig deeper. Another thing that really severely affects dyslexic students is their working memory. So if they have a working memory deficit, what that means is that they have a hard time holding on to small pieces of information that they can manipulate before it gets moved into long-term memory. So kids that have a working memory deficit, you'll see that come up a lot when they're trying to sound out words, or especially if they get to like multisyllabic words, because once they figure out a chunk, they can't hold the chunk long enough when they get to the end to put it all together. And you're like, oh gosh, like they had it, but they just can't hold on to it long enough. And that is their working memory saying like, it's already gone. So sometimes you'll see that characterized in here. The ability to temporarily store visual and verbal information, and it also presents as poor reading accuracy and weak comprehension. So a lot of times also, these are the kids that get to the end of the story and they can tell you the very last thing that happened, but they might not be able to go all the way back to the beginning. But it's important to remember too that this is not, bless you, this is not the only reason why that happens. Some kids aren't making mental models while they're reading, they're not visualizing and doing some of the other things we know are characteristic of weak comprehension. So it's always good to dig as deep as you can. The other one is naming speed and retrieval, and this one is very interesting. If you've ever done, has anyone in here ever given a CTOP? So in the CTOP, they have the rapid naming test, and it asks you to do a sequence of, sometimes it's objects, depending on who your population is. If it's kindergarten kids, we're not going to give them letters yet if they don't know letters. So sometimes you do colors, sometimes you do objects. If they know their numbers, you can do numbers. And it asks them to just name them as quickly as they can. And what they're trying to see is, can they take in that visual information and then pair it with the verbal process to be able to name it, and how fast is that connection between what they're seeing, how they turn that around in their brain, and how they can get it out. And so what we see is that kids that have a deficit in naming speed and retrieval, that's another sign that they have a predisposition for dyslexia. And so one of the problems I run into in my district with the CTOP is that special education thinks they own it. And so whenever I say, well, I'd love to give the rapid naming just subtest of the CTOP, everyone goes, no, you can't do that. Because we want to be, if we go ahead and end up testing this child for special education eligibility, we need to be able to give that assessment. And so I was like, well, what am I supposed to do as the reading person? I need something that I can give. And so one of the things that we just recently got this year, and I'm still even learning how to use it, my reading specialist too, is the RAN and RAS assessment, and that is also specifically, it's just another rapid naming type test. So in some kids I'm not interested in giving the entire CTOP to, I just want to see if maybe this will flag something, and so that's another assessment that's available that you could give, especially if your special ed department thinks they own the CTOP. So if they have deficits in naming speed and retrieval, it's characterized by a weakness in the brain to retrieve needed information quickly. So when you're doing letter ID, when they're looking at sight words and you've gone through them 8 billion times and you're like, I know you know this one. But if they can't come up with it, if they're not automatic and they're struggling in that area, then it could point to a retrieval problem. Presents as poor reading fluency, poor sight word recognition, and poor menticity. So these are just some other assessments that you could give to dig a little deeper into that. And then the last one is oral language. And oral language is a hugely broad category. So the oral language category goes into almost all of these other categories and comprehension and expressive language. There's a lot of different assessments that you can use for oral language, but it depends on what exactly you're looking for. So kids that have a deficit in oral language, they usually have a weakness in language comprehension. So these are going to be maybe some of your students who are in a language-based learning classroom or have a communication disorder, or kids that you're worried about that might have a language processing issue. And there's a lot of confusion around the structure of language, and it presents as poor comprehension and difficulty with written expression. Those aren't the only things that are affected by oral language, but a lot of times we'll see struggling students struggle in those areas. I did put the BAS and the DRA2 on here for a very specific reason. These are criterion reference tests. They are not norm reference tests, so they're not standardized assessments. The GORT 5 is a standardized assessment on here. But I put those two on there because as a reading specialist, I feel like these are the only two assessments that really ask them to pull it all together. And that's just such an important thing to be able to see is, yes, they might be struggling in some of these areas and they might have deficits here, but are they using compensatory strategies? Like, is there a way for them to pull all these things together and be able to read and compensate as they're going? Because some kids are amazing, and they could really have deficits in phonology, but they get to the end and they know exactly every single thing that happened. And it's just as important for us to look at their strengths as it is for us to look at their weaknesses, because we want to beef up where their weaknesses are. But if they have some real strengths in being able to kind of pull the whole reading process together, then we want to value and capitalize on that as well. So I think that that's really important to remember, but I do want to point out that those are two very, they're subjective type tests because they're criterion reference, they're not as kind of strict as the other standardized assessments that are on there. So, but again, these are just ways to help us drill down once we get somebody flagged as potentially having a reading disability or potentially being dyslexic, how can we look even deeper at what the issue might be, okay? All right, so I'm gonna let you talk for a few minutes. And I want you to think about other early literacy assessments. There's a million of them. I only put those up there because I think they speak to really digging into very specific aspects of a child's reading experience. But what other early literacy assessments do you use to be the screens? At the beginning of the year, what are some that you use to monitor student progress? Because that's another huge piece of MTSS. Once we figure out what it is that is the problem, we start providing intervention. How do we follow that and make sure that they're making effective progress? And then where do you think you might need to focus some resources in your buildings, in your districts, in terms of early literacy assessment, okay? So talk to your teams for a couple minutes. I'll walk around while you're doing that. If you have questions about any of those specific assessments, hopefully I can answer that, and then we'll share a little bit. And then we'll listen to Craig.
Oh, okay.
Hi, what else do you use for early learning screening? Commitment awareness behavior chronologically, like it's not simple. Like it varies by grade. Individually, one-on-one. It's correct. We'd like to use this adjustment because all you do is but it's pretty much with the kid or whatever. It's like when they that's good. Were you all trained in that? And that's where it stopped. How long is every day? 20 to 25 minutes. How do you make first thing in the morning. What do you have another 30 Right. You guys do it. We don't have But.
Oh, okay.
Oh, yeah.
You're in Okay, yeah, but then the sound group comes up a little short.
So, well, I can't say I never heard of it.
Yeah. Percentage-wise, roughly,
So, yeah, do that book probably more than. I would start with that. And actually,
they might, but then that's where yeah.
all right, does anybody want to share anything that they're also using or that they have found successful in kind of identifying kids that might need additional services or might be struggling with any kind of learning disabilities or reading struggles? Anything up here that we haven't talked about that you're using?
We're trying, this year was our first year, obviously, right?
Yep. Yep.
So, we want to bring that because the new recommendation becomes.
Yes.
And so we didn't want to get invested.
Yep.
And having some money into it. We looked at the children's hospital one.
Yep.
But then they pulled it back and said, no, we're going to actually do our trial. So we want to do it.
Yep. Yep.
So now we're in the middle of trying to get it done.
Yeah.
We're about halfway, but it's, and if we took it for what it was right now, there is an alarming number of flags.
Right. Yep.
I guess that's,
And so you have to think about what you're trying to get a picture of. And if you're only trying to screen for kids that really have a predisposition for dyslexia, like one of the things when I started really digging into what dyslexia is all about is this idea of it being neurologically based. And one of the things I found out through my research was that kids who have dyslexia or have a predisposition for that actually have different gray matter in their brain from birth. You can actually do an MRI or a brain scan at birth, and their brain has different gray matter than people who don't have dyslexia. And so when you take an adult and you do the same thing and you look at their brain, if they're dyslexic, you'll see some of this gray matter. And that to me was just fascinating because I never knew. Yeah, I never knew that that would happen. Yeah, that's going to be part of the newborn screening now. Everyone's going to get MRIs on their kids to make sure they're not dyslexic. But no, but I thought that that was fascinating because what that really says is that, you know, sometimes people will say anybody who has is learning disabled in reading or has a reading disability is dyslexic, and that's just not true. But there's a big misconception about that is out there. Like, what does it actually mean? And it does mean that a child who has dyslexia, their brain does function differently. And so we have to see what parts of the brain do we need to exercise to kind of beef up some of these different areas, which some of the assessments that I had shown on the grid, the presentation is in the folder, so you'll be able to have those in there. Some of those really target those areas so that you can then try to do some activities and do some strategies with kids to see if you can exercise those parts of the brain and get them up to speed. But there's a lot of misconception out there about dyslexia. So if that's what you're really going for and you're really looking at it, then you have to start, when you're doing something like the DIBELS, you have to give it one-on-one, which takes time. We were just talking in front of you about the DIBELS and how sometimes it's the reading people that are giving it or it's other people that are giving it and not the classroom teachers, which, you know, the classroom teachers are the ones working with the kids, so you want them to really be looking at how their students are doing, getting to know them, listening to them, and doing those kinds of things. So there are other reasons why kids might flag on these things. So that's the hardest part, I think, is really drilling down. Is it because they're predisposed to dyslexia, or is it because they have a weak vocabulary? Is it because they, you know, didn't have a lot of language at home when they before they came to kindergarten? There's a lot of different reasons it could be. So then you have to start looking at it on a kid-by-kid basis. Like, okay, so here are all the kids that got flagged. What do we know about them? And that's when you start to triangulate. You know, you look at how they did on the DIBELS, you look at maybe how they're doing in the classroom, you look at some other measures so that you can really say, like, you know, they're really falling down here, or it's really just this one piece. And that's where you look at the discrepancy between one piece and the rest of their profile. So those are just some of the things you might think about.
This is more of a comment. And
Yes.
I worry that with these screeners that we're going to overly label and restrict kids. And I'm going to say that as someone who was diagnosed with dyslexia in college. And my two younger brothers were diagnosed in first grade. We all have a little bit different presentations of how it works, but as a result of not having a label, I learned a lot of strategies, some of which were obviously on my own, but God, I'm glad I went through all that.
Yes.
And I'm glad I wasn't labeled, and I'm glad I wasn't put in a separate room, because in those days, that's what they did in the district that I was in.
Yep.
So, I just want to caution everybody that as great as getting more information is, be really, really careful. And I think this MTSS main conference we were in earlier, when they spoke about, how it's been translated actually, that's why we're coming at this as beginners, even though our schools have already done some.
Right.
Because we have to treat it from the beginner standpoint, because it's gotten so drilled down where it becomes level 3 kids or, so forth. We're needing to shift our thinking and say, guys, like, they all can do it. And if we don't come at it that way and use this information for building the tools and helping them with strategies, we're actually doing more harm than good.
Absolutely. And I belong to the Literacy Leaders Network through the state, and one of the first things that when we started talking about the dyslexia legislation there, and they were talking about how you can do some of these assessments and then the school can say, well, we feel like this student might be dyslexic, and people just went ballistic because it was like, oh my, I can't even imagine the amount of teachers who will be coming forward saying like, these kids are dyslexic, and then how do you control that? How do you control this explosion of referrals of kids that, you think are dyslexic? And when you think about the amount of work that has to be done to drill down that information and triangulate and look at these kids as a whole child, like that whole thing, will that work translate, and will that actually be done and be done in the right way? Or will we kind of overgeneralize with information? All this information is now coming at us, and they're saying, you have to screen all these kids, and you have to identify by this time, and these things have to be done. So, it's hard to think of not overgeneralizing that to the kind of general population and saying like, oh yeah, these kids, they were flagged, they have this. It is a very, very fine line. And it also takes the whole MTS system, because it's just like with special education, you have to start with the least restrictive. So tier 1 is the least restrictive. That is your classroom instruction. What is happening in the classroom? Are students being successful? So even if they were flagged on a test like the iStation or the iReady or the STAR, even if they're flagged on something like that, if they're being successful in their classroom, do we need to label them as dyslexic? Or, so a lot of real thought has to go into that whole process. And when you're setting up the MTSS system and really coming together as teams to talk about kids through the process and really look at them from a lot of different angles and not just the assessments that we give. So thank you for saying that. All right, I think we're ready to transition. I hope I didn't take up too much of your time, Craig, did I?
So we're going to shift gears a little, because I'm going to talk a little bit about assessment literacy sort of more broadly. Who here works supervising other educators, particular, like in that sort of role? Okay, so this tool I'm going to share with you today really comes from the lens of back in the day, I focused primarily on educator evaluation, and one of the things that we really struggled with was just how consistently poor assessment literacy was, really frankly at every level, from teachers to supervisors to practitioners. So this tool was developed to sort of support that, and the primary way it supports it is by taking sort of the large universe of assessment literacy, which can feel very overwhelming, and help you zoom in on the questions that are probably most important for you, so that you can figure out what's probably a not right now conversation, and focus in on the what's probably, where's your zone of maximal development. Quick little quiz. If I was to say, I have this assessment, and it is reliable and valid, what are the potentially less precise issues with phrasing an assessment that way? I've got an assessment that's reliable and valid.
certain media. So I'll go ahead.
It assesses what it says it assesses, and it assesses it repeatedly.
So I'll give you an analogy. I have a car. It is good and works and works. Like, what's the potential challenge with like those two descriptors? Very. I mean, good is like good at what? So back to the assessment. From an assessment perspective, like assessments aren't valid. So like that's the thing I would challenge is usage. You can have like support for the validity of a use, and so to say an assessment is valid is like for what? Are we using it as a screener? Are we using it to hire and fire? Are we using it to like do promotion? Are we saying to like trigger additional questions? So I think that's the other thing. And then is sort of my own pet thing is like. It's hard to imagine what a valid, non-reliable assessment was. So they're like, I've got a good car, but it doesn't work. I'd be like, that's not a good car. And so like, I consider reliability a subset of validity. So I think this tool is really trying to take that sort of initial framing of like, I know assessments are reliable and valid, and try to have a more nuanced vision of that. So the question that we're going to zoom in today is like, how do we help educators develop the skills to effectively use assessments within their own classroom? So the two ways that we're going to take that is we're going to take this large universe of assessment literacy skills, and we're going to break it up into kind of using two different lenses to help us zero in. The first is we're pretty comfortable with this idea that we're going to have some set of skills that are beginning skills, and then once we sort of have those at like a reasonable place, we can start focusing on sort of more progressing skills, and once we have those a little bit more in place, we can focusing on some more strengthening skills. It's not that everything is perfectly linear. Like, in baseball, if I've got my throwing and catching pretty square, I might start working on double plays. By working on double plays, you might strengthen that sort of foundational skill as well. So, but it'd be very hard to start jumping to sort of the highest level things when we don't have a good foundation. So, but one way this takes sort of the full body and zeroes in is to say, are you focusing on sort of the beginning skills? Are those in a good enough place that we're focusing on progressing skills or strength? So that's one lens we're going to use. Did that make sense? The professor once said it's not supposed to be hard. And then the other thing it does is it takes the world of assessment literacy, and these are the 4 fundamental questions. And this is a tool that we developed in consultation with our principal advisory cabinet and teacher advisory cabinet. So there's 4 major things that we should be thinking about with an assessment. So first, like purpose, like a clear understanding of what this assessment is supposed to be doing. I am doing this assessment for a reason. When I shared this tool with some principals, someone said, because the very first question is, can you tell me why you're giving every assessment? And they said, I couldn't do that for every assessment in our district. I'm like, great, not great, but like, so stop the press is, that's the only question you should be thinking of, is like, I should just know why I'm giving every assessment before we worry about some other very basic things. So purpose is one big broad category. Alignment, that the thing we have students doing is matching the claims that we think we're making. I see all the time claims that we are assessing higher level thinking, and then what kids are doing is, like labeling a chart. And I'm like, oh, this task actually, the only skill I need to know is like, the names of things. I don't actually have to do any. So alignment's a big piece. So then action, if you have an assessment that you aren't doing anything with the information, like I don't really care, if you have a good reason or it's well aligned. The whole point of an assessment is action. One of the analogies I have is like, I think too often I see people like have action just be a street. They stop, pull off the side of the road, take the assessment, and get back on the road and keep driving. As opposed to sort of every time we give an assessment, we should be at a fork in the road where we're taking the assessment, we're taking the information from the assessment and making a decision of left or right. Too often I think we have this like, short of anything going like horribly wrong would be the only reason you like make a turn, and that's just not a very effective use of time. Like, if you already sort of knew that the wheels we're still on the bus. Like, if the only question you're asking from an assessment is, you know, are the wheels totally coming off? You know, like, so that's action. And then finally, communication. How are we communicating this information to important stakeholders, parents, students themselves? That changes a little if you're talking about very young kids versus older kids. But still, like, if I'm giving this feedback to a student around, like, you're struggling with phonetic awareness, how do I communicate that to a first grader in a way that they, like, understand and, like, know, oh, I'm working on phonetic awareness, and, like, so they have a sense of that. You obviously don't need to present them with, like, you know, statistical charts. Communication of that. So do those 4 broad categories make sense? Yeah. Great. So I'm very proud that if you Google assessment literacy continuum, this tool is the thing that comes up. So most of you have computers.
Is the first one that comes up?
It's the top hit.
It's the top one?
It's the top hit.
Congratulations.
So if you have a computer, Google assessment literacy continuum. If you don't have a computer, we will hand you a piece of paper. So raise your hand if you need a paper version of this. Or if you just are dying to have a paper version.
It is in color, I'll tell you.
It is.
I knew I'd get someone. You're welcome.
So here is this is the way that this tool is designed to be used, but I think one of the beautiful things about it, it was designed to be free general. So like one of the things that I will challenge you to think about in a minute is like, what are ways you adapt and apply this? But the basic concept of this tool is, I start in the first category, purpose. If I'm working with teachers, I ask my teacher, read the first line. Do you feel like you can do that? The answer is yes. We go to the next bullet, to the next bullet, to the next bullet, until the point I say no. So then I say, okay, that's the thing we're working on with purpose. And then we jump to the next category and do the same activity. It might be the case that I am here on purpose and way up here on alignment. That's totally fine and expected. You might pay extra attention to the thing that you're further behind on. So then you walk away with 4 statements of like, these are the things that when I'm thinking about my own assessment literacy, these would be good things to focus on. So if I'm doing ed eval and I'm looking at a professional practice goal, I might have 1 or all 4 of these be my professional practice goal. I'll make an important distinction here. There are parts of the ed eval rubric that are focused around assessment use, and there's parts of the ed eval rubric that are focused on assessment results. This is really a tool talking about assessment use. I don't have it memorized, but we do have a crosswalk of like where some of these different things show up in the ed eval rubric. Yeah, I'm not going to pretend that I can do it on memory, but I used to be able to like say the numbers. It's 1B, standard 1B, but I don't feel confident right now. So does that make sense? So I want you to take a moment, and if you are an individual, you can do this for yourself, but if you're thinking about, if you have a group of teachers that you oversee support, you might think around like teachers in general. So take 5 minutes to like walk through this activity yourself to see like, oh, you know, where would we land on each of those? Make sense? Mm-hmm. Take a moment.
I feel like more people might want paper copies.
Yeah, you have 1 paper copy.
Yeah.
There are more of you than I have.
Because they saw Craig Waterman was going to be here, and
Exactly.
we're going to see that.
No.
It's sometimes it's easier to see it.
No, now I have to track this thing. Anybody else? I would say that is definitely my,
Is that really?
you know, totally unscientifically, but I think the vast majority of people are, you know, like, you know, and so part of what I think the message here is like, you know, that like, you know, like Google will sort of be like, okay, like we just, you know, and you can sort of see some patterns here of like, you know, like this is beginning to figure out like how are you adjusting, like, which should get. Yeah, because the experience you have, we're just getting overwhelmed with it.
And that's right.
So were there any things that people noticed that they did that activity? Where were most of you sort of landing? So I think one thing that just sort of an experience of like working with different people with this tool, I think most people are landing sort of in the beginning phases. So if we're talking with one group down here, like, you know, we wish we were here, but like really, if we're honest, like this is sort of where we are. And like that's actually pretty normal. I've almost never experienced a district that was claiming that they really are like working on these highest level things. And lots of people are really saying like, I can't, you know, the example I gave you, am I able to articulate the purpose of all of my assessments? Like, I've had district leaders tell me like, no, we couldn't do that. No. Okay, like that's the first thing to worry about. Like, before we start getting into like, are we considering multiple data sources before making decisions? You know, that's an important thing to be doing, but you can only do that if you really are clear on like what are all your assessments supposed to be doing. So that's what we did. So when this was initially designed, it was designed to support a conversation around educator evaluation, but we've also been using it as sort of a framework for thinking about assessment literacy in general. In addition to this tool, obviously we're doing this work around trying to identify screeners and provide additional guidance around literacy assessments. We also are working on developing an assessment audit, which would be a protocol that a district could use to look across sort of their entire assessment landscape in the district, ask questions of like, you know, like, are they spending too much time doing things, like, you know, where there's pieces of efficiency. So we're working on those two different projects at the department to provide some more specific guidance around assessment use. So this is an earlier version of that. But take a moment to turn and talk to your partner or a small group. How could you imagine using this tool within your context? Okay. Oh, crap. Yeah, no, I was definitely saying like.
Yeah, but I was just wondering how the dyslexia legislation.
Yeah, I think about all things, it's just like computer kids. So like, curriculum basis.
The time kids enter the program, just like
I'm curious to hear how people thought they could use this tool. What are ways that they would operationalize it? What can you imagine doing in your own context? I've heard lots of different interesting ideas. Don't be shy. I know it's late. Don't make me sing.
We're just saying it's good conversation starters. It's good to use it with our staff, but at the same time, we have to really define what some of this looks like. I think you made that point well with the.
Yeah, I provide strategies and plans and use to support students. So in their mind is for all students, oh yes, I see all these suggestions, but not specifically to each student. So I think digging deep and really pulling it apart.
And that's a great point. So none of these bullets. This is not a rubric. We do not define what high quality. What is the appropriate way of doing this? Like, what would be? I'm able to articulate the purpose of all my assessments. I can imagine I can do that really well, and I can do that very poorly. And like this tool is not trying to is not weighing into like what would be a good use of that or poor use of that. We spent the time trying to do that. For example, like, can I say what type of assessment? Like, there's nothing that's more debated than like what are the types of assessments? like is it criteria and norm reference? Is it is it a screener? Like is it formative? Is it we have so many different like models for that. So you're right. Like there's a level of like what's the quality of this bullet? They're triggering for a conversation of like, do you feel confident in that? So we haven't weighed in on like what are high quality versions of each of those bullets. But really, let's zoom in and let's have a frank conversation. Like I'm identifying a place, for an assessment in my overall like strategy. Like what would be good versions of that? And that's just the context are so different. Like what that would look like in a first grade reading pull out. That's very different than a 7th grade, like math classroom. Other uses that people were thinking of using it for. Go ahead.
Well, our school is relatively new. We're really a district district in Brockton, and so they just hired me to be the Dean of Data and Accountability, and so they just like put together a data office, and
That
everybody
sounds
is
like a
doing-
really small job.
Um,
You didn't have a lot of time on your hands.
But we can see that everybody, like I look at this and we're doing the testing, we're doing this, but to me, this has helped me to help put it together, like identify the various assessments we're doing, and we have to, you know, do professional goals, student goals, so to me, it sets the framework of how we can begin.
Yeah, and thinking, you know, like the things that we see that really get ignored too often are use and communication. And like the serious drop off in communication, like, you know, like that's the thing that I think people really struggle with. And even frankly use. There's a lot of assessments being given and the data is being looked at and conversations are being had, but there's no actual like, you know, left or right decisions being made. It's like, oh, that's interesting. I'm gonna go back and do the same lesson I was planning to do anyways, you know. Other uses people were imagining. Do you want, Bill, kind of wanted to say some last words before people left?
Oh, yeah, she's in the back, actually.
Yeah, so
But I actually have a comment on this,
Yeah.
right? So one of the things I'm thinking about when I'm looking at this is we're trying a more personalized PD approach in our building this year. And it's something new for us that we're trying, but you know, having teachers kind of choose their own path of either something that's going to meet their evaluation goals or another goal that they're looking at. And so for some districts, if you're really starting out with assessment literacy and it's going to be the overarching goal of something, I feel like this would be incredibly helpful even to do personalized learning under the umbrella of assessment. So everybody's learning that assessment, but everyone has a different entry point into this kind of rubric here. So, you know, what's your path going to be based on it might be helpful.
Great. Other ideas? Go ahead.
I just, my colleague and I were talking about using it in different departments. I could sure see Sharon, I'm actually in high school, and I could see Sharon this in high school, using it for people to really look at what they're doing, you know, how they're assessing kids and how much time they put into their kids and stuff.
Yeah, high school particularly around like how are you communicating, because you'll see some of the higher level like communication things is around investing in kids. Because really like, you know, when you're talking about high level communication, it means that like the student understands, you know, or parents, but like well, actually it's like students understand like what is the feedback you're given, and you know, one of the things that we just learn a lot from just like feedback in general is like it's so easy to be like, you should do X, and like the student has no idea what that actually means. It's like, okay, you know, I should be more precise. Great, no idea what to do with that information. I'm going to proceed.
Can you be more precise?
Can you be more precise? Can you be more precise? Exactly. So it's like, oh, I need to be like thinking about like that I am supporting every point with some details. Okay, I understand what that means. And here's an example of when you did it well. I'm noticing you did it well here. You didn't do it well here. You did it well here. Okay, and ideally the kid buys into that. That's important because obviously, and that can feel like that's not really about the assessment, but it's like if the point of assessments is to use information, and that's the reason why I do assessments. If kids aren't using the information, that's a problem with the assessment. And it's in terms of like technical assessment speak, that's what we might call like consequential validity. But we should be thinking about that kind of stuff too. Like, is this having impact outside of just like the information part, but is it having the actual impact? We need to consider consequential validity in that larger conversation of is the assessment good? Right? Other points? Well, I'm definitely happy to both take questions through email. On the assessment continuum itself, my email is actually on the bottom. So if like years down the road, you're like, wait, I had a total question about this. Hopefully I'll still be there. That's too very. Yeah, so happy to do that, I'm sure. Did you have a couple last things to share before we release people?
I know I'm the only thing standing between you and 495.